One of the things that we often use the term is campy, and certainly we'll be kind of covering that a bit with the first version of Batman in film, 1966, and then it's pretty darker version in 1989 by Tim Burton. I'm John Chang Dan Edmonds.
Hello there.
Yeah, I thought that that'd be a interesting way to start off this discussion is what is that makes things campy and stuff. Certainly like I was surprised to learn that Susan Sontag, who we've referenced before, actually wrote as one of her first works as notes on camp and stuff, and in essence kind of really kind of set the stage, I guess, for that term being entered into the mainstream.
Yeah, I mean the thing is it's kind of, I don't know, it sort of means different things on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, camp is basically slightly gay in the UK interpretation of it, I would say. That's
interesting.
How it would be referenced in, it's often sort of like used in reference to, I suppose, characters who are sort of fairly stereotypical, and it's sort of, like you often just think of like 70s TV show, sort of fairly bawdy, double entendre laden TV of the time is, I guess, where you'd use that expression. I think in the States, it's kind of something where it's kind of something is not really taken too seriously, and it's kind of overtly not taking itself seriously. I don't know. How would you describe the US interpretation of camp?
Yeah, camp, I think in the American kind of connotation or the general kind of sense is a lot of times where it's a little bit corny, is a term that would kind of be associated with it, or like I'd say like kind of just a little bit quirky, or kind of like goofy in a sense and stuff like that, like where it's I don't know about taking itself seriously, but like that it's there's this kind of like earnestness to it that like like kind of that to make it campy, like you gotta have to put something into it. Yeah because like it's not going to be campy if you're kind of like half making a half-assed effort at it and stuff like that. You gotta whole ass it and stuff.
Sort of an earnest effort towards the ridiculous maybe is kind of maybe a better way of looking at it. Perhaps the way I still don't really quite get. I don't completely understand what constitutes camp to American audiences, in all honesty.
Well, certainly,
certainly Batman in the 60s.
I think we'll really start getting into it. I did want to mention one quick thing before we start diving into it. Offline, you and I talked a little bit about how this psychiatrist Frederick Wertham, basically his book that's kind of really the best known for it was that it talked about like comics being a source of juvenile delinquency, and kind of like this kind of corruption that like because at the time homosexuality was considered a mental disorder. So it's funny that you were saying about camping gay and stuff, but Batman Robin was actually one of the key things that Wertham targeted as like kind of this will lead to like kind of rampant homosexuality then, or something along those lines. So but we'll talk a little bit more about him later, but I just thought I'd mention that that was an interesting kind of connection though that you were saying about the UK sense of that is something can't or can't be is gay and stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because of course homosexuality was illegal in England for until, well, I can't remember exactly when it was, maybe the 70s or the 80s or something like that. So probably by in the 70s, I'm sure they turned it around at some point. But yeah, interesting. I think we should sort of, and I was going to say, I suggest that we call this series the Battle of the Batmen, just to see who is the real Batman. Please stand up, and we can actually see who is the most sort of authentic. Or yes,
that's definitely his fighting words with
it is
the diehard fans.
Oh God, yeah. Who knows? Might even get some comments on this one. So yeah, we're looking at the 1966 kind of, I mean, the 1966 movie is almost like a sort of a culmination of the TV series. It's almost like, hey, this TV show is doing pretty well. Let's make a movie of it. It certainly doesn't try to sort of, I mean, like practically every other version, there's no origin story or anything else like that. And then we have this complete sort of reimagining in 1989 with Tim Burton. But yeah, I guess we will start with the 66 and
yeah, they definitely kind of, on the one hand, they threw everything at it, like, you know, pulled out all the stops in the like any vehicle that they, and then any garage and stuff, they, you know, Batman and Robin were in it and stuff. But at the same time, in reality, it's only just slightly longer than an episode. I mean, that's what's kind of funny about it too, you know, that like it wasn't that much more for them production wise probably than, you know, just their weekly you know, episodes that they do. So it's like kind of this mixed bag. But meanwhile though, you had all the villains. I mean, you know, they all came out, you know, like Joker, Catwoman, Penguin, Riddler, you know, it's almost like they're kind of like the what's it called, the opposite of the, you know, Justice League, right?
Yes. I mean, you know, you got the Cesar Romero is there as Joker, Lee Meriwether, probably not as well known, I would guess, as Julie Newmar as Catwoman, possibly even Eartha Kitt. You've got, I can't remember his name. Who is he? The guy in
Burgess Meredith? You can Frank Gorshin.
Yes, Frank Gorshin is the Riddler, who is, you know, it's just I think he was my favorite of all the that era of villains for whatever reason. And what was his name again? Somebody Meredith as
Burgess Meredith.
Burgess Meredith as the Penguin.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm recently, I don't know why, but I just started watching In Harm's Way, and this is like a World War II movie that's kind of like a mix of what we saw with Midway, where they kind of show like Pearl Harbor being attacked and all that, and then leading into like kind of the things going, you know, towards Midway. I don't think they quite get to Midway and stuff, but anyways, he's in that actually as his intelligence officer, and in it he's quite the womanizing charmer or stuff like that. So it's kind of really funny to see him in a, you know, less kind of odd role and stuff.
I'm sure, right? Because they just so cemented those roles. It's hard to imagine them in pretty much anything else. I think the irony is that probably it's such a light-hearted sort of version of Batman that probably the actors probably all like fought in the war, or at least one war, and are probably all actually like sort of hard as nails compared to some of the, you know, follow-up actors who played them. But anyway, so yes, and of course the dynamic duo,
of course,
with Adam West and Burt Ward as Dick Grayson.
And I have to say that for me, like until of course the recent years, I mean, that was Batman and Robin. I mean, you know, like kind of, I was probably all the debates and all that other stuff was just lost on me. You know, I guess I was not a comic fan per se. I was more of a TV fan before, you know, like kind of, you know, before I, you know, dove more into the comics themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously grew up watching Batman on TV like that, and it was only sort of, I think I had actually been introduced to The Dark Knight Returns and The Killing Joke before, or maybe at about the same time as the Tim Burton version came out. And it's funny in a way that how you know, people now may look back at the 1960s Batman and think, oh, how removed is this from the character? This is so far from what Batman should be. In a way, if you grew up with that and you read something like, you know, The Killing Joke or The Dark Knight Returns, the comics, those seemed completely like, you know, left field and you know, such a sort of dark and violent sort of version of the Batman story that those seemed almost sort of surreal in comparison. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, I think what was interesting about Batman TV show is that basically, I think it almost took like a kind of a somewhat sort of sarcastic Andy Warhol pop art approach to interpreting a superhero comic, in that they literally tried to sort of make it as visually much like a comic as possible, hence all the sort of pow and, you know, Biff and whatever, Batman style slogans would pop up. And, it had a bright sort of primary color. All the characters were larger than life. So it was kind of like this mix of, like you said, this kind of earnest kind of commitment to the characters, which made it, which made you take it somewhat seriously as a kid, but as an adult, it just becomes a lot funnier. It's just a sort of very kind of sarcastic humor that runs all the way through it, that you don't necessarily pick up as a kid, but makes it quite funny as an adult to watch.
I mean, to me, one of the campy elements to it was that like everything had a sign, that like a water distiller would be like, the bad water distiller, kind of.
That's
or
right,
like,
yeah.
Or they would have like like if they needed something obscure like a signal oscillator disseminator or something like that, it would be a bat signal disseminator oscillator. It just would have it all spelled out too, labeled and stuff, and it's like kind of there were labels all over. It was almost like somebody's OCD's kind of fantasy and stuff.
That's the sort of funny thing, isn't it, about Batman? You kind of think there's always like this argument in other sort of versions, later versions, about how unstable Batman is and he's damaged and all this kind of thing. But there's a kind of like there's a sort of a complete, outright, unabashed narcissism in the 1960s Batman, in that everything has his name on it and it all has bat symbols. It's like, if this is like, this is all my stuff, okay? But I mean, in terms of the character, that's never even vaguely explored in the 1960s version. He is a completely uncorruptible, moral person who's just a sort of a pillar of his society, and that never does anything wrong. Or kissing Catwoman is about as risque as he ever gets, and things like this. So
I think that's really what they wanted to project, though, was that he was so committed to order that everything had to have its proper place and proper labeling. It's something that like I'm not sure. I guess the target audience of this was clearly, the younger kids and stuff, with maybe like the parents supervising or stuff, because like the whole bit about like, when there was the bar being attacked, right, stuff, and then like there was a debate about like, like kind of where risking their lives for these hooligans that were drinking like during the middle of the day, right, like kind of so it's this kind of implication that like people who drink are like degenerates and basically like Batman was like lecturing Robin about, but even they deserve a chance, like kind of that kind of idea.
Well, I mean, I think generationally, this is the 60s, I'm sure the basically Batman kind of represents the parents of the generation coming up in a way. So it's kind of kids laughing at their parents' earnest kind of authoritarian upbringing, I would say, which is why, and I guess that's the kind of thing. There was a sort of similar thing in real life, and you had people who were sort of taking acid, wearing ridiculous clothing, and sort of opting out of society. And it's just like, well, our authority does not work here. It's you've got people who've just completely dropped out of society. You're just like, well, all you can do is sort of say, oh, this is not a good thing to do, and wag your finger over here. And that's the kind of ridiculousness of that time, I think, sort of portrayed in the stuff that Batman has to deal with. Yeah,
certainly, like that idea that they're still trying to keep one foot in the 50s, like kind of the Leave It to Beaver kind of era and stuff. But the reality is, like you said, this is an era where, like kind of, I mean, like drugs, the drug culture and kind of the free love thing is like kind of really, like that's running in full force in the background and stuff. And that's what's interesting also about like kind of the little interplay, like you kind of mentioned a little bit with Catwoman and stuff, which of course like kind of it's interesting how that like he totally either ignores or is like not like being this brilliant mind that observes all these little details, right, like where the clues are always disseminated with like kind of just like this the quickest kind of tinge or whatever stuff. But meanwhile, he doesn't notice that Miss Kitka is kind of like often like talking about purring or things are perfect and stuff.
Yes, for the greatest detective, he does miss a few tricks now and again. I mean, I think that's what I always really enjoyed in the 1960s version, is the fact that when the Riddler leaves a clue, it's like the most convoluted explanation. It takes Batman 5 minutes to explain to Commissioner Gordon, and it is so obscure. It's like, right, so this is, and that's a balloon. There was a balloon that was done on this date there, and it just goes off on one. Those are just hilarious. So, I mean, that's by far the most sensible things in this movie, because, I mean, it starts off with the Bat copter and a shark attack. And,
many years before Jaws.
Yes. And luckily, we have the Bat shark repellent to, stave off the sharks. And I think what I love was the fact that a dolphin, sacrifices itself to save them. That was just a great opening sequence. And then the whole concept of being able to dehydrate and rehydrate people as the main sort of plot device that carries things through is pretty out there.
Yeah, it's just stuff like that really to call it campy actually would even be kind of like like liberal, I guess. There's also things like that where you kind of wonder like how much of it is the writers kind of knowingly doing nods that where they're intentionally kind of making it funny, and other times where it's like kind of like that, again, that earnestness where it's like kind of like they're just kind of just diving into this world of Batman that then you can't help but laugh, but meanwhile what, like kind of the writers going like, come on, don't you buy that? And
I mean that's really the fun part of the 1960s show is just the earnestness with which Adam West and Burt Ward deliver their lines and have to sort of like buy into the scenarios, even though they're just totally ludicrous. It's just a lot of fun to watch that.
Like to me, one of the classic lines is, Batman, sometimes, some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
That's right. Yeah. You can't. Yeah. So, I mean, it's got a kind of a very, I suppose, kind of a 60s-ish kind of one world peace kind of ending in order for Batman to reconstitute the world leaders, he has to design a very sophisticated dust recombining machine to put them back together after someone sneezes on the remains of them. Sorry, again, as always, spoiler alerts. But this idea that he thinks, oh, maybe if I've mixed up their personalities too much, I wonder what effect this will have. And the idea that maybe they'll all start thinking together, and we'll have a more peaceful world as a result.
I mean, I think that's what's interesting also, is that like it does kind of have this somewhat global message on one hand, but the other is like kind of it's not meant to be like kind of too deep in any ways. It's kind of this kind of campy fun that and I think for the most part that's the thing that I have to for me personally, I find it like endearing, or that like it's something that I just still enjoy, like kind of to this day and stuff. Like when I watch it, I just can't help but like laugh at some of these kind of campy lines and the humor and stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's quite witty, really. Some of the sarcasm, it's pretty entertaining. And I think as well, it's just that's the weird thing is, though, it's like you can't really say, okay, this is a comedy, because it's kind of it almost takes itself a little too seriously. That it isn't just out and out comedy. I mean, my daughter watched the 1966 movie and she absolutely loved it. Yeah, she thought it was hilariously funny in parts. And I say it's one of those things where there are things you pick up on as an adult, and there's things that are just so in your face, like like I say, a shark, attack gone wrong, that, she obviously found that funny. But yeah, it's just a very sort of interesting interpretation of comic book. It's kind of a comic story is something that's funny, the funny pages, as you would originally, describe comics. And I think it's an interesting sort of look at how we view escapism, really, more than anything else. Like that version, everything seems like a lot of escapism in the 60s was fairly colorful, over the top, and not that really rooted. People weren't too worried about it being rooted in reality that much.
Right.
And as we go on, it's almost like the things have to be grittier, darker, more realistic as we've gone on. And now it's almost like a sort of, we'll obviously get into those later on, but with the Christopher Nolan ones and the more recent Matt Reeves one, it's like, well, who's the more realistic of the two? I don't know. It's like they're probably even the Matt Reeves one has taken it. His is so removed from a superhero movie that almost just feels like a detective story with someone wearing a silly costume. But anyway, we'll get into that in our next video. But so it's interesting to see how these things have or our attitude towards sort of comics has changed over the years. And just escapism in general, I would say.
I think that's the thing that we'll definitely talk about at different stages and stuff. Is just and we certainly covered that to a degree with Superman. That like these are kind of almost like mythologies in the sense of where it's interesting how like between what's portrayed and then also other times the discussions with fans and that like this kind of like almost back and forth between the two of where certainly the fans do kind of like vote with their wallets, and yet different times artists between the comics to the films or TV shows have their own kind of visions and versions that are projected and stuff that like kind of, I don't know, in some ways amplify some things that we've feel is like kind of innate to the what does it mean to be Batman, or what does it mean to be Superman? And other times, it just kind of like is I don't know. I feel like sometimes it's this thing of the not quite Schrodinger's cat, but more like this idea of like different times how until we project in some ways what our expectations are, or what we think they are, and stuff like that, it's still kind of like can be a little bit malleable, a little bit like kind of shapeable, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a modern phenomena as well of like the fanboy criticism. I mean, when Batman was on TV, it's not like we were going, oh, I'm not sure how accurate it is to the comics. You're just like, it's Batman. I just watch it. It's quite fun. It's on TV. It's not in a comic book. So yeah, and you need obviously successive versions. And it just makes me wonder if, like, once Batman has been remade for like the 8th time in a row, 30, 40 years in the future, or whatever it will be, will we have, again, kind of, there'll be so much sort of fan sort of management, and that will have a very kind of constrained character that can only kind of, or the movies will only, they'll become a narrow range of what you can do with the character because you'll annoy people in certain ways. I don't know, because that's, you do, I mean, I think we've talked about like Star Wars often felt like a kind of a remake by committee, and it really didn't seem to have any real genuine creative vision behind it at all, really. It was just sort of rehashing, and yeah, there's other people that made obviously a ton of videos on that, but it's it's I'm sure that happens with a lot of franchises.
And certainly the other part about it is like, with something like Star Wars, like, they're constantly killing off and adding characters, right, and stuff. Whereas for this, like kind of, this and the Superman and stuff, once you kill them off, like as they've, tried to do or done different times, it's kind of like, okay, now what? Kind of like I think, like somebody like Christopher Nolan's will discuss, like kind of, the smart thing is just, like onto something else.
Yeah, just don't do Batman movies anymore. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's kind of harking back to some degree, and maybe we should talk about the original comic. This whole idea of Batman not being lethal is not something he started out with. Quite a lot of the early comics, Batman just killed the bad guy.
Yeah.
He threw him off a building and he died. Or like one of the earliest ones featuring a character called the Monk, who was actually a vampire, from what I can gather. He just shot him at the end. He found the coffin, just shot him with some silver bullets. The idea that Batman doesn't carry a gun and doesn't kill people is something that kind of developed later on. But in the 1930s, people were totally up for a Batman that just gunned people down.
Right.
So, he's become more and more lethal, I guess, as the years have gone on. But certainly not something you would associate with the character.
And certainly we've kind of talked a little bit about it before, that DC Comics, the origin of it is Detective Comics, where like in a typical detectives kind of story, people got shot. I mean, that's just basically part of the whole noir thing. And so we like what became DC Comics kind of went further away from that until, like, kind of like you said, this non-lethal version that eventually evolved as becoming the shroud, I guess, of the mythology for some reason.
Yeah, and I think, as we talked about in the Dick Tracy video, it's Batman does feel a little bit like an evolution of Dick Tracy, in that he has more elaborate gadgets, more vehicles.
Yes.
and I think it was a fairly obvious way of explaining this in the comics, that he has to obviously be a millionaire. That's how he can have all these interesting gadgets and stuff like this. I mean, the funding department for Dick Tracy's police precinct must be pretty astronomical for all this stuff. But Dick Tracy was, again, as we said in that one, I think it's probably right in that, by making him sort of morally incorruptible, it allowed you to have a fairly sort of graphic violence that was portrayed by the bad guys. And I think with Batman it was probably something similar, and even the bad guys are similar to what we saw.
I was going to say, yeah,
it's a lot of mad scientists in the first run.
They're like kind of these warped characterizations that like are very extreme, and like you were saying before, and with Dick Tracy, that they were kind of like, like Flat Top is like kind of literally has a flat head, and here it's more about like kind of their appearance and their like kind of extreme kind of behavior, that like they're constantly like laughing hysterically and like or meowing like a cat and stuff. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of sort of, I think it was interesting in Batman. I mean, it's interesting that you have one character that's based on a cat and another one that's a penguin, but they're the only, I could be wrong, but they're the only two ones that come to mind that are animal based. But it's just weird that you've got two and the others are just an odd mixture. And they it's got, there's, I suppose, when you look at some of the other characters like Clayface and Mr. Freeze and all these other ones, there's a weird sort of mixture of semi-supernatural but not quite.
Right.
It's kind of one of those, and that's what I actually like about the cartoon series, because it has characters like Solomon Grundy, who's kind of supernatural, I guess. But they don't really quite sort of veer into that territory. But it's still kind of, there's still this kind of idea that basically everyone's kind of mortal and no one really has any kind of super duper powers, really, or they can be explained scientifically, we'll say, to some degree.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly kind of one of the things I think that really is a common thread, I guess, for the different ones, is that, like, whereas Superman from before, his powers come from the fact that he's from another planet and all that kind of stuff, but here we have a mortal being that, like, besides the fact that, like, he's wealthy, like, he's basically and I think that we'll get into that in the 89, that like it's this kind of question of, like, or not question, but like the projection of him being kind of something supernatural, but meanwhile, of course, he's very much flesh and blood and stuff.
Yeah, that's the kind of that's the theme that they've picked up on, definitely in the Nolan one and stuff like this. But yeah, this idea that trying to be something that is seen as supernatural but isn't is an interesting idea in Batman. I think that's probably what was so sort of compelling about it in the original comic, perhaps. And of course, he didn't get his own comic until 1940, because he was just a part of Detective Comics for most of 1939. The 30s and things like this. I guess that's probably as good a time as any to move on to the Tim Burton version.
I think so. And here, we talked about Tim Burton again and his unique kind of visions of things, with the Willy Wonka adaptation. I think this is to me, like one of the ways that like we really see how when he puts his stamp on something, like it's a Tim Burton film, even though that, like, to me, I would not have guessed, like, way before this movie that Tim Burton making a Batman movie, like what?
It's funny you should say that, because I remember pretty clearly 1989, when this was the summer movie, and they announced, first of all, that they showed some early images, and it's such a stark contrast from what you were used to with the TV show. And it was also the fact that they had Michael Keaton as the main. That was really, it threw a lot of people. I remember just knowing Michael Keaton as a comedian, or, from Beetlejuice. They're just like,
Mr. Mom.
Yeah. And I remember it's, I think why this was actually a perfectly timed movie for the end of the 80s, more or less, because what you had Gen X kids reaching teenage years, basically. So they were kind of rejecting all of the kind of standard sort of Hollywood action stuff that had come before it. And you then, I think basically 1990s and this kind of era was when you basically started getting stuff that was started to try and subvert your expectations, that was cynical, that was trying to sort of do things in a very unexpected way. And I think this was kind of like one of those weird kind of culminations where something that shouldn't have worked kind of worked, and it was actually a really good movie. It was when you heard that Jack Nicholson was going to be the Joker, my immediate response was like, oh yeah, that's obvious. Yeah, he should be the Joker. But yeah, it was a strange experience. It was one of those ones where you were expecting something like an 80s action movie, and it didn't really deliver that. It delivered something quite different at the time.
I think it's certainly, like you said, just both projected and lived up to this expectation that this was going to be, the summer blockbuster film to watch and stuff. And you had it was almost like for probably any fan or and probably like even like your average, teen, I guess, that like you were going to go see it with your friends. I mean, it was just kind of like one of those givens, I guess. And I think that's what's it's probably something that we don't have as common nowadays, like where on the one hand we have more superhero films more than ever, but yet there isn't that kind of I don't know, it seems like I wouldn't say so much, go so far as to say that like people are getting tired of superhero films, but I feel like, at least from my perspective, it's not the same kind of excitement, like kind of like, oh, let's all go see that.
God, you get like at least 4 per year now. It's like you can't get that excited about something that's like going to be almost a monthly occurrence, it seems. But in some respects, this, I think, more than, Superman kind of did it in a way with Superman 2 in particular, but this one sort of laid the blueprint for a lot of modern superhero movies, in that the characters are quite damaged in it, and that's become a key component of any kind of modern superhero movie. Everyone has to have some trauma that has led them to their, Iron Man had to have, had to sort of repair his heart, and Captain Marvel got, crashed and blah, blah, blah. So, that's really the psychological sort of element that was introduced with the 1989 Batman, is something that really stayed with it. And I think it's a really interesting because you've got Bruce Wayne is not, he's certainly not the morally uncorruptible Bruce Wayne that we're used to. He's quite aloof, removed. He doesn't seem to be particularly bothered about anything really, justice or even his possessions or anything else, as the Bruce Wayne character. Not about his business or anything. He's just sort of seems to be very removed from society. Whereas Batman, as Batman, he just seems to be obsessed with an idea and doesn't really seem like he has a particular target in mind. Doesn't really work with the police, unlike most of the other versions. Actually, he's pretty much a kind of a solo act in this compared to others. No Robin, this is really just sort of like an obsessive man who's on a very kind of that's all I can really say, is that he has a very intangible goal of obsessive violence, it seems. And you have Vicki Vale, who's kind of this supposed to be on the surface very normal photographer, who but also sort of does war photography and is obsessed with the mystery of discovering who Batman is. And likewise, Joker in this as Jack Napier, he's a fairly standard criminal, just interested in money and women, and that's about it. But after being disfigured, actually kind of transforms himself into a kind of an artist in a way, which is really a weird sort of direction. Not that he has any, again, it's kind of like his plan seems to be just to sort of rebel and cause chaos. But this idea that he's been sort of, completely mentally transformed by this experience is quite an odd one, really. And the fact that he kind of wants to remake the world in his image and starts to, he's a sort of vigilant, he's almost like a cultural vigilante, whereas Batman is a law and justice based vigilante in a way.
Yeah, there was certainly also like it's funny you were saying about the art and stuff like that. Because like I feel like in some ways we saw this a little bit with RoboCop, that like there's this kind of humor to it that's like kind of dark and twisted in some ways, because at a certain point where like similar to kind of Paul Verhoeven, where the news is specifically used, right, where we see them kind of like not having makeup and because like the Joker's tampering with different chemicals and then causing people kind of really die in this horrible kind of way that they're laughing till the smile, and that kind of, I think from what I understand, that's like kind of almost taken straight out of the comics, where like even though that like not so much that the chemical and the makeup bit, but like the fact that like that the people are dying with this horrible disfiguration, that they're this kind of perpetual ghastly grin and stuff.
I don't know if there's actually I'm not a big Batman comic book reader, to be honest with you. I only read the odd sort of some of the ones that Frank Miller did and things, but I think what's interesting is it's kind of a very anti kind of superficial storyline, and the Joker's there sort of like trying to get people to trying to say well, these pretty people on TV are fairly vacuous, and you can't trust them, and you can't trust me either, because he's going to gas them later on in the streets. But it's this whole thing of sort of questioning what's on the surface it's kind of an interesting sort of way of looking at things. And likewise, Bruce Wayne doesn't seem to be, he's not particularly impressed by his own materialistic goods, and Vicki Vale is kind of saying, what does all this sort of mean? This doesn't seem to be you, all this material stuff. So it's like I say, this all seems like a very kind of anti-80s kind of cynicism in this movie that comes across.
And I think the other thing that Tim Burton kind of started as a trend was like kind of having this grittier look to things. It is something that like I can't imagine or can't remember a time before, like because it seems like before then we typically just saw like, just typical street scenes, like even with the Superman, right, where Metropolis just looks like bright and airy, during the day and stuff. And unless you're in the subways and stuff like that. But in Tim Burton's kind of world, there's this kind of perpetual darkness that like kind of enfolds everything. And it's just something that I feel like he kind of set the tone for like a lot of the other, future visions of, what Gotham City would look like and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he has a very sort of Gothic aesthetic anyway.
Yeah.
But I mean, in this, it's really done effectively. It looks like sort of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, but, but done on a kind of a more, modern scale. And I mean, I think the production designer on this actually committed suicide after winning an Oscar for it, apparently. Yeah. But I mean, they are pretty amazing. I suppose that's the other thing to remember is a lot of the effects in this are, what's the word I'm looking for? Not CGI, basically. Practical effects.
Practical effects,
and massive sets that were all sort of built fairly elaborately. Because I think quite a lot of money went into this at the time.
Yeah.
But the clever thing about this, and I don't know if this is something he realized or something that was, I'm guessing he did it during the production, but you can actually, because it's so dark, you can't easily spot the effects. And then there's this very simple but very clever way of kind of hiding the seams, so to speak, on the effects. Because even now you're watching a 4K stream of it, you can kind of see the bits that are just sort of animated, and you can kind of see when they're dangling off the church tower. Well, it's two little models. But aside from a few glimpses like that, it's pretty well hung together, actually. And I think it's pretty well done. But yeah, there's some really great kind of vehicle design and production design and everything else. And I mean, I think it was really clever that the makeup artist didn't do too much to Jack Nicholson's face, really. They didn't try and go over the top. I mean, I think he's sort of saying, he was quoted as saying, basically, I wanted more of Jack Nicholson to come through than anything else.
Yeah. That's definitely like, I preferred that much more to what we saw with Dick Tracy.
Yeah, Dick Tracy was so heavy-handed. And I mean, even, I don't know, it's like, when you look at something like, the Suicide Squad version of Joker, say, with his, his kind of metal teeth and everything else, it all just feels so kind of over the top, really. But yeah, anyway. And I think
and the music too, like kind of just to kind of complement things and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising how, we often say how it's a shame that movies have lost, a recognizable
I was gonna say,
And I mean, Danny Elfman really does sort of like pull it out of the bag on this. It's kind of like, I would describe it in a way, and it's like a sort of 30s or 40s film noir on steroids. It's kind of the soundtrack. It's got a very recognizable theme, and it has those kind of classic noirish touches, but it's just kind of amped up to something that's really kind of in your face and recognizable. So yeah, I mean, I think Danny Elfman hadn't done that much stuff when he did the soundtrack for this, apparently.
Yeah, not before this. I mean, he's Oingo Boingo. Kind of that's what everybody knew him from before that. Right. Okay. But then after this, like everything changed.
I'm sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of just very sort of creative elements to this that really kind of elevate it a lot, I will say.
At the same time, I think the other really groundbreaking at the time shocking was the fact that, like, I mean, as all said and done, I mean, here the superhero kills the villain.
Yes. Yeah.
Spoilers of course and stuff, but I think this definitely was just one of those things that like really I just was, I don't know, shocked, but it just really caught me off guard. I didn't expect that, and but at the same time, we up to that point we had set the expectation, as we said, of superheroes being non-lethal, kind of that idea.
Yeah, and I mean the Joker is pretty horrific in this, and he is killing quite a lot of people.
Yeah,
and he's disfiguring his girlfriend and stuff like this, and it's kind of pretty dark, really. It's kind of lightened by Jack Nicholson's kind of funny performance, but it's pretty interesting the way that's sort of done. He's quite happy to kill just about any of his people who work with him. Yeah, he's definitely comes across as unhinged. I think one of the other things that surprised me was the bit at the end where it's almost, I can't remember how it happens, but it's like they're having a fight, Batman and Joker, and it seems like he pulls out his teeth and and you can't tell if those are like his, he lost his teeth in the accident, or if this is supposed to be just a weird extra set of teeth he always keeps in there for these kind of occasions. It's very strange, but I love all the different outfits though, and of course you have a soundtrack by Prince. I don't think they're Prince's best songs, in all honesty, but it's kind of it's kind of an interesting addition.
Yeah, I feel like it was in some respects a little bit out of place, but in another respect kind of made it a little bit more hip, I guess, and stuff. And
yeah, it's funny. I mean, obviously Prince is a great songwriter and all this kind of thing. Don't know if if you're a fan or not, or whoever is, but it does feel a little, I would say I almost preferred, because it takes you out of this sort of pseudo alternate 30s 40s noir universe and introduces these this sort of
funky kind of
funky sounds.
But meanwhile, kind of I feel like it was almost like a nod to like having somebody like Billie Dee Williams playing Harvey Dent. I mean, that was like an interesting choice. I totally forgot he was in this.
Me too, actually. I forgot as well. It makes you wonder, if Burton had a third movie, would he try to have? It would have been really interesting to see if he'd had Billie Dee Williams as Two-Face or something like that.
Seriously,
pretty cool. Yeah,
that would be something to see.
Yeah, I didn't do any research on it, but was there any particular reason why they switched from Burton to Joel Schumacher for the third?
That's something I didn't really get so much into. Like, and then even on top of everything else, it's also like Michael Keaton didn't come back and stuff. So I feel like what happened was like just kind of like different people, like my sense anyways, and certainly somebody maybe can back this up, but I feel like it did fall into like kind of the contract negotiation kind of territory and stuff. And then like I felt like it's also hinted at a little bit, like kind of with Michael Keaton's future movie, like Birdman stuff, where like they kind of almost in some ways that was like the poking a little bit satire at the things that kind of transpired and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I watched Birdman. I did enjoy it, but it's kind of like you do wonder if. I mean, you obviously did lots of other movies in between.
Oh yeah,
we do obviously just think of him as like 80s Batman. It's very hard to sort of shake that. I mean, it's a very odd ensemble of characters in this film, really. And Kim Basinger at the time had only really, the only movies I'd known her from, and I hadn't seen it at the time, but I knew her from 9.5 Weeks. So
of course,
I was probably too young, and I just sort of thought, oh, it's that movie up there with Mickey Rourke and Kim Basinger. And that was about it, really. There wasn't a lot else she'd been in. So it's kind of weird in that you had a comedian, a kind of someone who's done sort of erotic fiction as the leading lady, and then Jack Nicholson as the Joker. It was a really weird kind of, but it all kind of, as I say, it all kind of pulled together. And it made you realize actually just how good an actress Kim Basinger was.
I mean, the thing that struck me about this movie was like that she did a lot of screaming. Kind of like, it was almost like every other scene.
Like there was a lot, wasn't there? Yeah.
And she did it well, though. I mean, certainly, like it wasn't. It just, she definitely projected. Kind of, it was like it was almost like a distinctive trademark for some of the different scenes and stuff. It was just like something happens and Kim Basinger screams.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way that she's obsessed with Batman as this kind of dark hero. But it doesn't extend to the Joker. She's not really impressed by his, and I find that sort of odd as well, that that becomes like almost like one of the main parts of the story is him trying to woo Vicki Vale and I guess it kind of goes into this thing of him sort of all of a sudden becoming this kind of creative auteur and seeing her as this sort of perfected sort of woman things. It's and he even comments on her war photography in it. He's like, oh, this is brilliant. You know, this death and destruction, it looks fantastic.
Right.
Yeah.
So depending on whether or not we go into it and stuff, there's actually a remake that she's in of From Here to Eternity. You know, like it was a mini series of stuff that she did with Natalie Wood as, you know, yeah. So I don't know, like it's could be interesting to see her again and stuff. And then, you know, because, you know, like I said, there's not much that we know her for. Never Say Never Again though. She was in that one.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So she was pretty good.
That's a remake. We still haven't done that actually. That's probably the only Bond movie we can actually do on the show because it's the only real remake. But yeah, classic kind of 80s actress. And it's interesting because she's kind of almost the protagonist for the first half of the movie, and that we're seeing sort of everything from her perspective, and not from Bruce Wayne's at all, really.
Yeah. Yeah, and I thought that was interesting also that like like you said, we really don't see, you know, Bruce Wayne until like probably like the middle of the movie or so, and you know, like, because and that's something that we kind of started mentioning a little bit, is how Batman in this world is like this kind of mythic, you know, creature of the night, like it bordering on kind of possibly like a Dracula kind of figure and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's very vampiric, and the fact that you have various venom criminals all the way through the movie describing, oh, you know, looking terribly, you know, cowering in terror at this potential sort of
by the bat, you know, kind of like he's the bat,
yes.
but he's not even like, you know, Batman yet and stuff, and it just, I think that's the thing that they kind of broke away from, besides, you know, getting away from Robin, was like just also this idea that like he's in cahoots already with the law enforcement. He's kind of like I said, this lone figure, and in some ways that like they're not quite sure what to make of him and stuff. That's something I think they started in this particular Batman. It was a unique, I guess, kind of trend.
Yeah, in a way, it actually makes him more sort of powerful as a vigilante if he's not associated with the police. So it's kind of, in some respects, it kind of makes him, I don't know, it's kind of an interesting take on the character, definitely. No, I think it's also very interesting, this idea of who creates who and the damage, who does what. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but I think it's interesting that, you know, they, in this version, which is, I don't think in the comics, the idea that Jack Napier, you know, shoots his parents and thus creates the Batman, and then from Bruce, and then Batman then sort of creates the Joker from Jack Napier. So it's weird how this kind of, there's this weird cycle of dysfunction that creates these characters.
Yeah, that was a really interesting take. That it's definitely unique to this particular movie. The other kind of like funny kind of connections to vampires and Dracula stuff. We actually had Michael Goff playing Alfred Pennyworth here, and he was from the Dracula, the Ham House version, as Arthur Homewood and stuff. And Jack Palance, who plays Carl Grissom, who we talked about in the what's called the Christmas Carol, you know, kind of remake version. He's also played the Prince of Darkness a few times himself.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Classic Dracula movies, they are too. Yeah, I mean, there's one thing you can say for Tim Burton, is that from what I've understand of his filmmaking, he often will stay within budget, and he also has this amazing ability to get really big stars involved in his movies. You know, I mean, this is quite a, I mean, it's not a conventional cast, but quite a lot of big names, really. And now that seems to be the case a lot of the time. You'll often find some pretty big names in his, even if they are mostly Helena Bonham Carter and Johnny Depp most of the time. But it's, you know, it's, I think as well, it's, I mean, you know, he's from an animation background. That's originally really where he came from, and was, you know, probably fired by Disney because they didn't know how to market any of his stuff. But, you know, maybe that is what gives this movie such a distinct feel from a lot of other movies at the time. It's kind of, it's very kind of, it feels like a sort of animation, because there's lots of very sort of odd angles that things are shot from, and not just jaunty angles, but it's the idea of seeing the bat wing flying in like this. It's feels a lot like a cartoon to some degree.
It feels also like a Disney movie though, in that respect. Like that kind of like you feel like you're on this ride, and that it kind of captures this kind of certain energy after things really get rolling.
Yeah, there definitely is a Disneyfied element to it.
But meanwhile, when you look at like things like the balloons, it's got this kind of twisted Tim Burton kind of touch to it as well. So it's like kind of this weird kind of mix.
Well, it has a lot of, it's very reminiscent of, I find a lot of that sort of stuff reminiscent of cartoons from the 1930s. If you happen to play the video game Cuphead, if you've seen that, they kind of meticulously tried to recreate animation from the 1930s. And that really does feel a lot like, his style. And he often has things that are even darker and more thinner a lot of the time. But yes, and a surprisingly good movie actually. I rewatched it and I thought, you know what, I don't know how good this is going to stand up to the test of time, but actually I thoroughly enjoyed it. Really good watch actually. It made me, I was kind of coming into our Battle of the Batman and thinking, this is going to be a clear win for Nolan. But no, it's actually really entertaining. I think it's just one of those things, Jack Nicholson's performance is really entertaining. The script's generally pretty good. It's quite witty in parts. And it's very interesting visually. It's hard to fault it, really.
Yeah, Tim Burton actually says that like the Killing Joke was the first time that, it was actually, he with the first comic that he loved and stuff, and then it's his favorite. So it was interesting. Like he's not a big comic book fan apparently, but that particular one for some reason really spoke to him. And
I think the whole idea of sort of taking comic book characters and giving them sort of much darker stories was something that was already in place during the 80s. Alan Moore did a lot of sort of interesting stuff with some of the bigger DC characters. And
never mind, of course, the Watchmen, as we've talked about.
Of course, yeah. So I would say I think it gets my award for favorite Batmobile of all of the movies. Robert Pattinson really got the short end of the stick, I think, in terms of
cool vehicles, huh?
But it's either this or the 1966 Batmobile for me, I think.
It's a really tough contest because of the fact that between the different ones, this one is definitely up there. And then of course, I still like, do we see it in I guess we do see it in the first Batman, as we'll talk about next week and stuff, in Batman Begins. I was wondering whether we saw the Bat vehicle yet in that one.
Yes. So any more final thoughts on 1989 Batman?
No, I think we really kind of drove it home and stuff like that. So I think we'll definitely look forward to talking about the upcoming or the 2008 version with of course Christopher Nolan, and then the more recent version 2022.
Well, actually, are we talking about the 2005? Do you mean Batman Begins?
Oh, sorry, 2005.
I was going to say, because I watched that one. Until next time, I guess.
Till then, it's John Chan with Dan Edmonds, and we'll see you at the movies.